On the morning of December 6, 1917, a city woke up like any other. Bakeries opened. Streetcars rattled down icy roads. Children walked to school, breath fogging in the cold Nova Scotia air. 20 minutes later, the largest man-made explosion in human history, before the atomic bomb, would erase a piece of that city from the map. This is the story of the Halifax Explosion. Not a bomb, not an attack, just two ships, a harbor, and a series of small decisions that added up to catastrophe. To understand why this happened, you have to understand what Halifax had become. By 1917, World War I had turned the city into one of the busiest ports in North America. Halifax and Dartmouth had grown to a combined population of roughly 60 to 65,000 people, and convoys were carrying men, animals, and supplies across the Atlantic to the war in Europe. Ships gathered in the harbor's Bedford Basin before setting out together, protected by anti-submarine nets and warships because German U-boats were hunting in the Atlantic. The threat from U-boat attacks was severe enough that the Allies had instituted a full convoy system just to get ships across safely. So picture the scene. A narrow stretch of water called the Narrows, packed with merchant ships, troop transports, and munitions vessels, all moving in and out under wartime pressure. Looking back, it's easy to see how something like this could happen. On the morning of December 6th, two ships were on a collision course, and neither captain knew it yet. The first was the SS Emo, a Norwegian steamship. It was leaving Bedford Basin, bound for New York, where it would pick up relief supplies for occupied Belgium. It was running empty, riding high in the water, and, due to a delay the day before, running late. The second was the SS Mont Blanc, a French cargo ship, and the Mont Blanc was not running empty. Hidden below deck was one of the most dangerous cargoes ever to enter a civilian harbor. Roughly 2,300 tons of picric acid, 200 tons of TNT, 35 tons of high-octane gasoline, and 10 tons of gun cotton. Nearly 3,000 tons of explosives in total, all of it bound for the battlefields of France. For context, that's not a bomb. That's a floating arsenal, slowly making its way through a crowded harbor with almost no one outside the ship aware of what it was carrying. At approximately 8:45 in the morning, the Emo and the Mont Blanc found themselves heading toward each other in the Narrows, the tightest, busiest part of the harbor. What followed was a sequence of last-second maneuvers, signal confusion, and misjudged turns. The two ships collided at low speed, only about 1 knot, barely faster than walking pace. Exactly who was to blame was argued over for years afterward. An initial inquiry pointed at the Mont Blanc, but a later appeal ruled that both ships shared responsibility. A 1-knot collision sounds harmless. It wasn't. The impact tore open the Mont Blanc's hull, and barrels of benzol, high-octane fuel stored on deck, ruptured and ignited. Within moments, the ship was on fire. And here's where the story takes its darkest turn. The crew of the Mont Blanc knew exactly what their ship was carrying. They knew it could go off at any moment, so they did the only thing they could. They abandoned ship and rowed for shore as fast as possible, shouting warnings that most people on shore had no way of understanding in time. What happened next is, in some ways, the most haunting part of the story. The burning, unmanned Mont Blanc drifted toward the Halifax shore, toward Pier 6, in the working-class neighborhood of Richmond. And instead of fleeing, people came closer. A burning ship in the harbor was a spectacle. Crowds gathered, drawn in by the rising pillar of smoke. Office workers watched from windows. School children pressed their faces to the glass. Firefighters arrived and began preparing hoses, with no idea they were rushing toward a 3,000-ton bomb. One man, however, understood the danger better than almost anyone. Telegraph dispatcher Vincent Coleman, working near the docks, learned what the Mont Blanc was carrying and that it was about to explode. Rather than running, he stayed at his post and sent a final warning down the line, urging incoming trains to stay clear of the city. It was the last thing he ever did. He was killed in the blast, but his warning is credited with saving an incoming train and its passengers. For nearly 20 minutes, the fire burned, the crowd grew, and nobody outside the ship truly understood what was about to happen. At 9:05 in the morning, the fire reached the Mont Blanc's cargo. The ship detonated in what witnesses described as a blinding white flash, visible from dozens of miles away. The blast released energy roughly equivalent to 2.9 kilotons of TNT, making it the largest human-made explosion in history up to that point. The explosion tore through the Mont Blanc and out across the harbor. The shockwave shattered windows up to 50 miles away, and the sound was heard hundreds of miles from Halifax. It wasn't just the blast. The explosion displaced so much water that it created a massive wave, surging roughly 60 feet above the high water mark and pushing nearly 3 blocks into the city. Then came the devastation on land. An estimated 325 acres of the city, virtually all of North End Halifax, were destroyed in an instant. More than 1,600 buildings were leveled. The Richmond district, where the crowds had gathered to watch the fire, simply ceased to exist. The human toll is difficult to pin down exactly, because the chaos that followed made an official count nearly impossible. Estimates range from roughly 1,800 to 2,000 people killed, with another 9,000 or so injured in a city of just over 60,000. One detail that's often overlooked: an extraordinary number of the injuries were to people's eyes, because so many bystanders were watching the fire through glass windows at the moment of detonation. Flying glass caused an unusually high rate of eye injuries. Physicians treating the wounded performed nearly 600 eye operations, with roughly 250 resulting in the loss of the eye entirely. That single, grim detail directly led to a lasting institution. The disaster's toll on victims' eyesight contributed to the creation of the Canadian National Institute for the Blind. As if the disaster wasn't enough, the city's agony continued the very next day, when a major blizzard dumped 16 inches of heavy, wet snow over the ruins, burying survivors, blocking rescue trains, and turning the wreckage into a frozen, sooty wasteland. What followed was one of the largest disaster relief efforts North America had ever seen. Within hours, over 150 physicians and more than 170 nurses had boarded trains from across the Maritimes to reach Halifax. Aid poured in from across Canada and the United States, most famously from Boston, which sent doctors, nurses, and supplies almost immediately. That gesture of friendship was never forgotten. More than 90 years later, Nova Scotia still sends an annual Christmas tree to Boston, as a thank you for the aid the city sent in 1917. In the rebuilding that followed, city planners saw an opportunity to do more than just replace what was lost. English town planner Thomas Adams and the firm Ross and MacDonald designed an entirely new neighborhood for the area. 326 homes facing tree-lined boulevards built from a new fireproof material called hydrostone. It became one of Canada's earliest examples of deliberate, modern urban planning, born directly out of catastrophe. Here's the strange thing about the Halifax explosion. By sheer destructive force, it was the largest man-made explosion in human history until the atomic bomb decades later. And yet, ask most people outside Canada if they've heard of it, and the answer is almost always no. Part of the reason may simply be timing. It happened in the middle of World War I, when the world's attention and the news cycle was consumed by battles in Europe. A disaster in a Canadian port, however catastrophic, competed for headlines with the Western Front. But in Halifax itself, it was never forgotten. Every December 6th, just before 9 in the morning, a service is still held at the Memorial Bells in Fort Needham Park, a quiet local act of remembrance for a disaster that briefly made one Canadian city the site of the most destructive man-made explosion the world had ever seen. For 20 minutes, on an ordinary Thursday morning, 2 ships made a mistake, and a city paid for it for generations.